Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. It's really nice to have you join us today for this wildfire mitigation presentation. This has been a little bit customized for our Discovery West Builders Guild. And today you have me, Romy Mortensen with Brooks Resources. I'm in charge of sales and marketing there, and we'll be working with all of you guys on your sales and transactions in Discovery West. And also joining us today is Alison Green. And I'm going to let Alison do a little bit of an introduction of herself because she's got such a deep, broad sense of experience with wildfire mitigation. So I'll turn it over to Alison, and we look forward to having you guys with us today.
Okay, and so briefly, and we'll let Romy introduce herself and make sure that y'all that haven't met her definitely get to know her, at least virtually here, before we get to finally meet in person. So my name is Alison Green, and I coordinate a group called Oregon Living with Fire. With that, there's a kind of variety of things I do. One of the main things that I do, though, is working on the creation and maintenance of fire-adapted communities. So communities that are taking action to prepare for wildfire well ahead of smoke on the horizon, which is a lot of what we will be talking about today. Is there anything, Romy, that you want to add for these folks on kind of you and the background on FireWise before we kick off into fire basics?
Yeah, good. Actually, I just want to let everyone know that my experience with wildfire mitigation and really trying to do the best we can moving forward with our neighborhood developments and making them fire resilient and fire resistant started several years ago when I met Alison, and she helped us with North Rim up on Aubrey Butte, helped us apply and have North Rim become a FireWise community. And then she helped us through the Tree Farm experience, and Tree Farm is an active FireWise community, and Discovery West will be one too. And FireWise is a neighbor-supported volunteer effort with all of the community members coming together to do what they can to their property to make it as fire resilient and resistant as possible. And so what we go through today will help you understand a little bit more about what we're asking of you in Discovery West in terms of your building construction and the landscaping. So with that, let's go.
Fabulous. So for folks today, I'm going to start with a little bit of fire basics. I'm not going to go super deep into the physics, but I need to really kind of touch on some of the basics about how we got into the problem that we're in to kind of set the stage so that we can talk about some really local context. So essentially, when we talk about how did we get here is a variety of things. Past management practices, fire exclusion. So essentially, folks putting out every single fire on the landscape for the last 100+ years has led to a buildup in fuels, which then is leading to higher fire behavior, as well as things that we're seeing that are making our fire seasons longer and drier and hotter. So essentially we have lack of folks in the woods and lack of folks actually putting out the fires. And then of course we have the added complication of we have a lot more homes in the woods. Folks that are living out in the forest is growing exponentially, and it has been for years. So not only do we have this increase of vegetation, we're trying to catch up on best management practices and making our landscapes resilient, but now we have a bunch of homes in the way where historically 100 years ago we didn't have these sprawling urban centers right where wildfires are going to occur. So really quick, we're also going to set the definition of wildland urban interface, or WUI. So a lot of times in people's minds that takes them to somewhere specific, it takes them to a location, whether that's down where I live in Lapine, down in the trees, or it's up on Aubrey Butte. People have a location in their mind. Today, what I'm really hoping we could do is not definitely think about a location, which is all of Central Oregon, but kind of suspend that geographic location rather than this is an area where wildfire can spread from vegetation to structures, where these homes and communities can ignite and burn completely independent of a large wildfire. So when we're thinking about this, we're thinking of like the town of Santa Rosa, we're thinking of downtown Wenatchee, we're thinking of places where people typically thought them as urban, but they are still experiencing large wildfire situations. And so essentially the conditions around each home or business, downtown Wenatchee had their industrial complex on fire from burning embers from a larger wildfire that was miles away. So really thinking about how homes and communities can ignite is, wildly different from fire behavior that we see out in the forest. So thinking about where that vegetation can support combustion of our structures. And also, again, not to dive too deep into the specifics, but this really kind of sets up this whole idea of correct building standards and defensible space or vegetation management. So the top triangle is the fire triangle. It's what a fire needs to burn. So it needs oxygen, it needs heat, and then of course it needs fuel. And we're not talking about fuel that we put in our truck. This is fuel as in vegetation or building materials that can readily ignite. Then down below is the fire behavior triangle. So whether a fire is burning very intensely or not so much, and it's a very small fire, it's not burning very quickly, it's not moving through vegetation very quickly, it has weather, so hot and dry. Our summer has been very hot and dry thus far. Topography, so if a home is built on a slope or you have a deck that's overhanging a slope. And then again, fuel. So the whole idea with the principles that we're going to teach today is fuel is the only thing that's in combination here. It's the only thing in common where if you take fuel out of the bottom triangle, the fire behavior is reduced, it doesn't burn as hot. And then if you take it out of the top triangle, it can't even ignite. So the whole idea is that we are going to take fuel out of this equation because that is the only thing we have control over in these two triangles. So, and we're also going to try our best to dispel this idea of the miracle house. A lot of times you will see in the news situations like this, unfortunately, where folks will see this and they're like, oh, those 4 houses, they're miracle houses. We don't know how they survived. It was luck, it was fate, it was insert whatever. And so what it really is the conditions around each of those homes that they really did do something around their house. They had, adequate defensible space. Their roof was made out of the right things. Their vents were covered with the right things. And so when we see a photo like this, rather than focusing on the homes that survived, I would really challenge you to look at the homes that didn't, but look at the vegetation around them. If fire was truly moving like a wave through the landscape, we wouldn't have the miracle house here. We wouldn't have these evergreen trees here that were completely untouched by the fire. Something is burning these homes down that is completely independent of that large flaming front that we kind of have in our minds that moves through like a wave in our minds, which is not actually the case. So what is taking out these homes is embers. So they are embers, same thing you get when you throw a log on a campfire, that spray into the air, and they can go anywhere from 1 to 3 miles ahead of the flaming front. So then they will land on something that's right up next to the house. They will land on pine needles in the gutters. They will fly into your vent space and ignite your attic. And so essentially these homes are burning from the inside out. And so these trees are actually singed on the side of the home. The trees shouldn't be green if the fire is consuming everything in its path. So really briefly, we're going to watch a quick video. And it's going to talk about kind of some stark differences that we can make around our house that's going to change its fate, change its chances, and increase its chances of surviving a wildland fire event. So this is actually a group called the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. They do research on hurricane, tornado, flooding, and also wildfire. So how can we protect homes from actually burning down and surviving some of these natural disasters? So they build homes in a wind tunnel. They blow embers at them to see what building materials ignite, essentially what landscaping survives and what doesn't. So it's about 2 minutes, and then we'll talk a little bit about the right choices down at the bottom with this diagram.
So from start to finish, we're going to start with our ember generators, which we use to recreate a realistic ember exposure. Embers are those small burning and smoldering particles that may travel ahead of the fire front. And what we do with our generators is we create the realistic exposure, and in our wind tunnel, we're able to throw them at a building. And then we have a building that has 2 sides to it, a good side, which uses wildfire resistant construction, and what we're considering a typical building that we would see in a wildfire prone area. Exactly as we expected, that mulch on the ground there caught fire from the embers. The fire from the mulch burned up under this deck, and this whole deck was on fire. And so this fire on this deck caused flames right against the home. And then if we look there at the base of the door, there was actually the flames from this deck that burned through the bottom of the door. And on the inside of the house, we started to see smoke and flames. And so because this deck was a combustible material attached to the building, when the embers led to the ignition of this deck, we got flames inside of the building. Here we are on the wildfire-resistant side of the house, where we had non-combustible siding, a 5-foot non-combustible zone, and a 6-inch gap. We had a metal gutter and multi-pane windows. And we see, in comparison to the non-wildfire-resistant side, this side had the same ember exposure. If you look here in the mulch, you can actually see some of the embers that had accumulated, but because they had no susceptible fuel to ignite, they just landed there and fizzled out. And here we have ornamental vegetation that, again, is susceptible to the embers, but because it's more than 5 feet away from the home, it didn't have enough energy to ignite, and it never led to a flame impact on the building.
So a few things called out in this video here is, really touching on, what is attached to the home, what is right up against the home, and then essentially the siding, the windows, and some of the eaves. So looking at, kind of eaves open or closed, we'll talk about that, but boxed eaves essentially don't allow for that heat to get trapped and swirl underneath and impacting the roof. The siding, of course, if it's made of wood is more susceptible to heat and flame, versus a fiber cement type of product. And then looking at windows, single pane really don't have the resistance to radiant heat. So essentially that hot heat that you can feel, single pane windows typically will break, which then allows fire to get inside the house. Where windows that are dual pane, they stand up to radiant heat a lot better. Then looking at what's around the house itself. So the mulch, really, really popular landscaping choice in Central Oregon. And I know Romy and I both are not going to come here to tell you can have no mulch anywhere ever on your property ever. What we really want to discourage is it being put right adjacent to the home, where then it can carry fire directly up to your home, whether that's up to a deck, up to the struts supporting the second level deck, or up to the actual siding of the house. And then, of course, looking at decking options. So, folks really love decks. I don't blame folks. I have a huge deck in the back. But looking at places where you can put some of the foil-faced, tape on some of the joists, or choosing bigger building materials that are harder to ignite, or looking at, some sort of composite decking, looking at pavers, some of those options that are a lot more resistant to impacts. And, kind of the proof was in the pudding in that video was the home that had some of these choices made versus the one that wasn't. Exact same ember impact, but the one that had some of these other choices made with fire resistant materials survived a lot better and was able to withstand that ember attack. So I'm going to touch on our built environment. I am going to preface this 100% by saying I am not a building expert. I work in fire. So I am definitely kind of preaching to the experts in the choir here. But I'm going to give you some of the best practices that I have picked up from some of my colleagues that kind of dance in both spaces, and some of the research on some of the main pieces of the home. So setbacks, roofing, kind of our siding, and essentially our screening and vents, fences, and decking, so attachments. And so we're really going to touch on both the home and the vegetation. If we have a community or a homeowner that's only doing just the vegetation mitigation, but they haven't done anything to prepare their home, the risk is still there, and vice versa. So if they've prepared their home, but they want a bunch of ornamental juniper all the way out to the street for 40 or 50 feet, they are going to have still risk to their home. So if we want a home to have its best chance of survival, it needs to both have fire resistant materials that it's built of, and also the vegetation around it needs to be resistant to embers. And then Romy, I would kind of pause here for a minute. Is there anything on the built environment that you want to let these folks know before we dive into some of the specifics?
No, I think later in the presentation, we talk about the specifics in terms of home construction and landscape requirements that we have in Discovery West. So I think I'll hold my comments until we get to that portion. Thank you.
So we're going to talk about setbacks. So essentially, this is a piece that really kind of looks at the whole community. So the top is an example from, say, like California, that really kind of shows that impact of if one home is ignited. Say we have a homeowner that is not complying with CCNRs, hasn't gotten a chance to mitigate around their deck, whatever it may be. They have, not taken the steps to properly mitigate. If we have setbacks to the point where the heat and the flame from one home can then impact the others, then we're off to the races, and we have multiple homes that then have ignited. And then we also have this home, this actually picture at the bottom here was actually up on Aubrey Butte. This was a local example. The other home that actually burned down was, I think it was close to 15 feet away. So they had 7.5 foot setbacks. And so you can still see just the sheer radiant heat damage from that home that was close by. So, we know that setbacks sometimes gives us pause, and it kind of gives us some heartburn, but there is a real world scenario that the reason we ask for a little bit more breathing room in between homes, especially in some of these newer developments as Bend kind of built out, is because the radiant heat impacts in the case of a wildfire situation or even a structure fire situation, and say the bottom example, can really, really be detrimental to the whole neighborhood. So, and then we'll talk about roofing. So Class A, for folks that don't know, there is folks that do testing on it to essentially see if it meets the requirements to be non-combustible or not. So Class A essentially is that it has reached the non-combustibility requirements. They do that testing down in Southern California at a university. Then Class B is those that, of course, don't meet that requirement. Knowing all of you that are going to be watching this, is there's no shocker here on what is non-combustible and what is combustible. When we're talking about building our homes, looking at some of these options for Class A roofing, asphalt shingle, one of our more cost-effective options is also a non-combustible covering. So if we're talking about covering our roof, the roof is the most vulnerable part of the house, 100%. And so starting at the roof when we're looking at its fire resistiveness is 100% clear, 100% needed. And so when the home, essentially has a roof impact, the home itself is, its destruction is inevitable. This is actually a photo out of Colorado, where, the home is technically still standing, but the roof, of course, is completely destroyed. That home is not going to be livable. So we harp on the roof, we harp on the valleys and the gutters, and we really kind of push this idea of like home preparedness starts at the roof, because it is the most vulnerable part of the house. And if the roof goes, the home destruction is inevitable. So talking about our joints, our valleys, and our ridges. So if it's a non-combustible covering, so metal, asphalt shingle, which is pictured, of course, here, is these on just their surface are not going to be impacted by flame. But if we have little joints, or the ridges are starting to peel back, the valley isn't maintained, or been taken care of, or it has pine needles this deep in it, then we're going to have a roof impact. As well as, when we're doing roof coverings, the roof covering itself may be non-combustible, but the rest of the building is not. And so anything that goes, the fascia, the molding, the rafter, the roof sheathing, anything like that those are, of course, made of wood or some other type of material. And so when we are looking at ridges and valleys, we really want to make sure they're in good repair and that we have them clear of pine needles and a way for those pine needles to come off the roof relatively easily. As well, when we're looking at gutters, making sure the gutters are made of metal so that if pine needles do accumulate in them, those pine needles ignite, they wouldn't melt and then impact the fascia and the molding and some of the other pieces of the roof. So opened and boxed eaves. I will note that the recommendation is for closed eaves because it stops, essentially, if we had a surface fire coming along the ground up to a home, that hot air would come up, it swirls, which of course has embers and a whole bunch of other things that can then impact your venting. It can impact your soffits. It can impact a lot of other pieces of your roof. So boxed eaves with, say, like metal or hardy plank or something of that nature is the best practice. For folks that like the idea, see a lot of craftsmen's homes out here with open eaves, these are the homeowners that we would have a conversation about, you know, maybe that 5 feet of non-combustibility, taking a very hard stance that 5 feet needs to be completely non-combustible to keep that heat from getting trapped in their eaves. And, you know, maybe even asking them to do 6 feet or 6.5 feet of non-combustibility to really make sure that that home has a good break so we don't get that hot air and those embers being trapped in an eddy, a wind eddy up in those open eaves. So siding, again, very similar to roofing, same testing. So looking at some of these large diameter logs and treated wood. Large diameter logs, I would say for me, I always picture it in the same way that, like the same way I build a campfire, is if I just put a giant log in the middle of my campfire ring, it's gonna be really, really hard to light on fire. I'm gonna have to hold, you know, a propane torch or something to it for minutes, you know, if not close to half an hour to get it to ignite. And so large diameter wood for either struts, for elevated decks, or for siding material, it meets the non-combustibility standard because of how long it takes to ignite. Treated wood, if you have a client that's really excited about having wood shingle siding or whatever it may be, there are products out there that they can treat that siding with. I would caveat that with like little asterisk, is if I go and meet with a homeowner and they tell me I have wood siding and I treated it, my first question is, when did you put the fire resistant treatment on it? And they range from, hey, last summer to 15 years. And so those treated wood, you know, it works, but only with retreatment. It's only as good as the treatment. So meeting with that homeowner and meeting with that client is talking to them like, okay, great. If you want treated wood, great. But these are some things that you need to do for maintenance and keeping up. It's like having, you know, chopping block countertops. There's some maintenance that goes with that. And of course, we have wood, vinyl, and synthetic stucco. A couple of those melt, and then of course, wood is flammable. So venting, I will spend some time talking about venting. This is one of the more recent discoveries in defensible space and home ignitability. Is we were finding homes that had, you know, non-combustible roofing, they had made good siding choices, they'd made good window choices, but the homes were still igniting. And so IBHS, the folks that did the video that we just showed, did a study on venting and really looked at what type of vents are susceptible to embers and then what should they be covered with. Is the 1/4-inch mesh that we had been using adequate? Does it stop embers from getting into those attic spaces, or do we need to do something a little bit different? So something similar to this, we're going to kick this off with a video that shows some of the different venting structures and kind of shows how many embers get through with different coverings. So you'll actually see the description down at the bottom of the video and what kind of vent it is and what it's covered with. And then we'll kind of go into detail on a few of these ventings. So there were definitely some winners on those venting structures, and there definitely were some losers on how many embers essentially they let into the attic space. So we're going to zoom into each of these photos and briefly touch on them here. So ridge vents actually weren't included in the video, but they actually perform really, really well in ember studies. As long as, the caveat is, as long as they are covered with 1/8" mesh, to make sure that those bigger embers are not coming into the attic space. You know, essentially one of the first recommendations that came out was like, oh, well, 1/16 inch. And it's like, no, but then that creates a whole nother issue with airflow and mold and a whole bunch of other things, where the 1/8 inch really prevents the bigger embers and the more destructive embers from getting in, but is still allowing for some of that airflow. So then looking at the gable end vent, luckily, these are not as prominent now in kind of building standards and kind of just building practices and popularity. Where like my home, for instance, was built in the late 90s. I have a giant gable end vent on my home. And so these are the most susceptible to embers, as you saw in that video. The embers were just absolutely pouring through these. And so when folks have a gable end vent, you know, making sure if you're meeting with a client for whatever reason they want one, making sure that it is covered with a metal 1/8 inch will prevent some of that ember. But if you can, you know, build for clients without gable end vents, I highly recommend doing that. Looking at the soffitted vents, so these actually performed really, really well. So these closed eave soffitted vents, just simply the way that the air flows toward the home, it's really hard for embers to come up and then all the way up into these soffitted vents, which is another reason why those closed eaves are so very important. Is not only do they prevent that heat trap and that wind eddy, but it also then prevents a lot of those embers from being able to get into some of the kind of those open eave vents that we see really, really commonly. So, you know, making sure that these are in good repair, that they're covered with that 1/8 inch. But these perform really, really well when they're closed eaves, and then they're the soffit vents as well for homes. So the open eaves, as you kind of saw in the video, the 1/8 inch, again, kind of another loser for how many embers it let through, which is interesting. So then when you cover it with 1/4 inch, it performed a lot better. So again, if we have a client that's really wanting open eaves in other places where it's allowed through CC&Rs, you know, making sure that that vent is covered with 1/8 inch. And then also we saw in the video that the fringe block really, really helped with some of that airflow and that ember attack and that ember impact that we were seeing. So something like this with 1/8 inch is going to perform really, really well here. So the last piece I would note is the under-home venting structure. It's tough because right now we are struggling to get product that is pre-made, and I empathize with that because the science is constantly evolving. But one of the reasons we ask for this is not only for ember attack, but because humans are humans. And so next thing you know, 5 to 10 years later, people want bark mulch, they want things up against their house, pine needles, leaves, whatever it may be. And so we end up with a scene like this. So that 1/8 of an inch mesh covering on the metal on the underhome venting structure is to kind of add that extra measure. Make sure we're not getting embers under the house, first and foremost, is the most important. And the second is that if we have a homeowner that, you know, down the line is choosing not to be as vigilant as we want them to be, it's an extra protection and extra help until we can get them to work on some of their vegetation and ground clearance maintenance here. So we'll talk briefly about attachments. I could talk about attachments and the what ifs all day long. Is when we are installing decks, fences, things of that nature, we really need to be thinking about how it could transfer fire directly to the home. So a big, beautiful cedar fence that then is connected directly to the house, it acts as a wick. So if it's attached to the house, it's part of the house. So if you have, if you have a fence that ignites and that is then connected to the side of the house, that house is probably going to be completely destroyed or heavily impacted. So we aren't going to go out and tell folks no wood fences ever and ever, forever, never. But making sure that the connectors to the house are beautiful wrought iron or some sort of non-combustibility, you know, material that is then connected to the house. Also treat the fences the same way that you would treat your house, making sure that you don't have pine needles, years and years of pine needles or bark mulch that's this deep up against those fences. Making sure you don't have bitter brush or manzanita or some other flammable species planted right up against your fence. Is that the fence is part of the house and it needs to be treated as such. So making sure that it is cleared and it has its own little bit of defensible space, as well as making sure that it is not, the wood is not directly connected to the house. So some sort of beautiful ornamental connector. You know, I've seen folks actually utilize composite decking or fence material to make it look like wood, but it's non-flammable, connected to the house, something of that nature where that you'll have kind of extra protection if the fence can't ignite, and then even if it does, it can't ignite the house. So looking at decking materials. So I will not tell folks again that you never ever can ever have a deck. If folks want a deck, there's a lot of maintenance that goes into it. Of course, we would prefer and give folks the options of non-flammable, you know, type of patios. So whether it's stamped concrete, you know, it's pavers, it's some sort of gorgeous outside space that is non-flammable, that's even better. If we have clients that really, really want a deck, looking at alternative decking materials, the composite are excellent for fire resistiveness. There's actually a hardwood, if folks want to pay the price point, called Ipe decking. That's a Brazilian hardwood, but it actually performs similar to the composite decking in fire resistiveness. So looking at some of those materials within your client's price point can really help them have that big, beautiful deck without it being more and more flammable as kind of like a, you know, a cedar deck that folks aren't going to maintain in 10 years. But making sure we're building them, you know, looking at that foil tape that was in our video, making sure if it's an upper level deck that it has big, beautiful, kind of bold struts, making sure that we take the steps so that when the homeowner is up to the maintenance, that they can really keep up with the maintenance, is making sure that the joints are clear, making sure that they don't have a bunch of pine needles and, you know, patio furniture and stuff on the deck that's then going to ignite it. But making sure that we make some of those choices up front so the deck is a little bit more safe. Again, I can talk about decks and answer what ifs for decks for years. But at the same time, if we're building them correctly from the start, you know, there are some materials out there that really can improve their fire resistiveness and still give the client that look and feel of a deck without it being as risky as, you know, a cedar deck that, you know, will need to be stained every year to maintain its fire resistiveness. So with that, before I move into landscapes, was there anything I missed, Romy, on kind of our built environment that you wanted to make sure I touched on?
No.
Okay.
Everything.
Awesome. So then, you know, as we were saying, kind of when we kicked off into the built environment is that's only half of the puzzle, right? Is making sure our home can survive an ember impact is just a piece of it. The next piece of it is the vegetation or the fuel around our house. And so looking at our landscape, y'all will probably hear in the news from, Oregon Department of Forestry, Project Wildfire, even from Oregon Living with Fire, is this concept of defensible space. So we're going to cut it into 3 zones. So essentially zone 1 is that first 5 feet. So like we saw in the video, that is, we're looking at what is directly around the house. How do our vents look? Do we have pine needles or branches overhanging the house? The next zone is zone 2, that 5 to 30. So this is kind of leaning green, and we'll dive into specifics here. And then zone 3 is if we have a client that has a lot more space, like for instance, I have an acre, so I got to be really flexible. I got my first 30 feet. And then I was able to take some kind of different flexible steps on, wildlife habitat and things like that. If I have more than 30 feet, there's places you can do that in your defensible space if you have a client that's very excited about it. So zone 1, again, first 5 feet around the house. This should be anything from rock to paver to bare dirt or some other non-combustible surface. This is an awesome place to put, like a walkway, or putting in some sort of, drainage for snow, or some sort of masonry work, something where there will not be a direct connection from whatever vegetation's in the yard to the home itself. And then also kind of looking at this too is the tree trunks themselves. I will be the first one to admit I have ponderosa pine trees within 7 feet of my house. They're trunks, but I also am maintaining their branches to make sure they're not overhanging my chimney. I'm maintaining for the needles that they then drop on my roof, because that's what ponderosa pines do best. And so really making sure that if we have a client that's super excited about having a tree, they have fallen in love with the tree, and we all do, that we don't have the branches overhanging somewhere that's going to pose direct risk to the house. And again, in this area, this is where the maintenance is critical for that homeowner once the home is built and in use. So a few examples for y'all to consider. So in older buildings, we see a lot of ornamental juniper. If y'all have folks that really want to xeriscape, they're really excited about arborvitae or cedars or some of these other species that are drought tolerant, they're low to no maintenance, please, please, please work with your landscape architects to have them away from the house, please. These arborvitae and some of these more evergreen type of vegetation, this kind of photo up here in the upper left hand corner, they look green until you cut into them, and then they are not, and they are a perfect trap for embers. And so if we have those right up against the house or within, especially that first 5 feet, that is going to be a huge, huge risk to those homeowners. Again, right up against the deck is another one. We talked about fences, but decks as well. Those decks need to get the same respect and treatment the same way that we would treat the foundation of our home or our fence, is at least a little bit of separation of non-combustibility so that they have a chance of surviving an ember attack and a surface fire. Again, looking at bark mulch, we touched on it. Oh Lord, bark mulch. Making sure that it is not at least 5 feet away from the house. Again, I'm one, practice what you preach. I have bark mulch in my landscaping, I do, but I have a 6-foot barrier of river rock all the way around my home to make sure that my bark can be out, it can be pretty, it can retain its moisture and be beautiful, but it's not going to impact my home if it ignites. And so what we see here, again, an example, the middle example is actually out of Eagle Crest, is they were having a lot of cigarette fires. So they'd have people that were flicking out cigarettes in their condos. They would then ignite the condos. And so they finally came back and they were like, no more. Gravel up against the house. And that staved off the problem. And so then the bottom examples are from Tree Farm. So when I'm talking about non-combustibility, I don't want y'all to have a moonscape. I don't expect y'all to meet with your landscape architects and your clients and tell them no vegetation at all anywhere in your landscape. These are going to be beautiful homes. They are going to be upscale homes, and you can have them be fire resistive and beautiful at the same time. But making sure that we are really strategic about those placements is critical, especially in this first 5 feet. Okay, so for zone 2, this is at 5 to 30. So this is really, and the easiest way to remember is this is your lean and green zone. This is where things are well maintained and well pruned. They're well irrigated, that they are high in moisture content. So what we really don't want in this area is a continuous sea of native species essentially that are high in oil content that can survive drought, because a lot of them either are very flammable or they are adapted to receive fire, so to say they can reproduce. For instance, like bitterbrush. Bitterbrush can't reproduce as well until fire opens up some of their seed pods. So we have a lot of native species that are not fire resistant. If you have folks that are super excited about that, there's an online fire resistant plant guide that you can use. But this is the area where folks need to be high in moisture content and low in oil. So highly irrigated, well pruned. Our trees need to be limbed up here. What we don't want is also ladder fuels, which is an example here. So the top photo, what we don't want to see in this area is some sort of shrub, regardless of what species it is, underneath, say, like a small young ponderosa or an ornamental juniper or something underneath a big mature tree that then would lead to a higher intensity fire. So we want to break up what we call ladder fuels. So essentially taking these two out of the equation would then allow for vegetation without it being a continuous ladder up into the tree canopies. The bottom example, I love this photo. When I say defensible space, it does not have to be a moonscape. I don't need us going out there and having a rock or asphalt donut around everybody's house. The landscape can be beautiful, well irrigated, and attractive without it being something where people don't feel like they can plant anything. Typically in your first 30 feet, anything that is deciduous for the most part is a really, really good choice. They're typically really high. Any sort of, aspen or birch or maple or something along those lines, those are really high in moisture content and they perform really well. Green turf, of course, is always a good choice. And thinking about some of those things that are going to hold on to the moisture and still be green in the summertime is a good choice in the first 30 feet. So in the last zone, I'll briefly touch on it because I know we want to get into some specifics around Discovery West. But for zone 3, this is outside that 30 feet. And so we're really going to look at the arrangement of the vegetation, its health, and its fire resistance. So what we don't want is essentially the top picture. So this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about ladder fuel. We have a bunch of bitterbrush. We have smaller trees that are then leading up into the canopy of larger trees. These trees are very close together. And this forest in general, so talking about health, this forest generally is overstocked and not all that healthy. The bottom example, same property after treatment. So this landowner actually had folks come in, they mowed it with a masticator, took out all of the bitterbrush, left some young trees, and took out a few of the trees, but not a whole bunch of them, to maintain some canopy cover. And so the fire behavior in these two scenarios is going to be vastly different. We're going to see really high intensity fire here that's not easily suppressed. It's going to be embers everywhere, really high risk. Down here, the fire behavior, if it was able to sustain itself, is going to be very, very low, very reduced. And so really thinking about, and then the bottom picture, it's not going to look like that for long. You would have bunch grass and a few small kind of supple shrubs that would come up, and then you'd need maintenance, but it doesn't look like that forever. And so folks that have that bad haircut feeling, it goes away very, very quickly after mowing. So for there, I think, was there anything else on landscapes, Romy, that I may have missed?
No, I think we can dive into the specifics for Discovery West now.
Okay, perfect.
More of the local context. So I think everyone was aware of the UGB expansion that we just went through that enabled us to do the master plan for Discovery West and move forward with what we've got going on right now. And the city has a comprehensive plan that they follow, and Their goal really is to create aggregated defensible space on all the UGB lands that came into the boundary. And they identified 3 mitigation measures to accomplish that goal. It was development pattern, the vegetation management of the lands, and the construction techniques that were used in the building on those lands. And so at Discovery West, we addressed the development pattern through our transect concept, and you've heard us talk about that quite a lot. It's the idea of having your higher density homes around an urban core or an edge. And as you move out towards really the WUI, or what we define as the break between development and wildlands or forest lands, you have your less dense properties. So in Discovery West, if you're looking at our map and our transect concept, on the east side, it's more dense, and as we move west toward Tree Farm, the open space that is the boundary or the border between Discovery West and Tree Farm, it gets less dense. We also address the vegetation management by implementing landscape requirements through a zone approach that Alison just outlined. The zones that Alison just outlined are general zone approaches. We have more specific zone approaches and definitions in our design guidelines for Discovery West. And so you'll need to familiarize yourself with that in terms of zone 1, 2, and 3, and how those relate to the space from your structure out into your landscaping. Our goal in that area, as you have learned, is to reduce the fire fuel that's close to the home and that ignition zone. We consider that area the first 30 feet from the home that can easily ignite. So our goal is to keep those fire fuels as low and managed as possible, and yet provide a really beautiful landscaped area for your residents and home buyers to enjoy. So I'm going to just briefly go through the different zones that we've identified in Discovery West. So for us, zone 1 actually measures from the edge of the home out 30 feet. And again, like we've said, our goal is to reduce the fuel close to the home in that ignition zone. So we are asking that you create and maintain a fire-free area within the first 5 feet of that structure by using non-flammable landscaping materials. And we had some good pictures in the presentation a little bit earlier on what to use. And so in that 5-foot ignition zone, we're asking that that non-combustible material be gravel or rocks or some form of mulch that's not bark, that's fire fuel. We also ask that you use non-combustible material underneath or within 6 inches adjacent to the bottom of your fence. We ask that plants only be fire-resistant plants, and we have an approved plant list that we have created for you to review in Discovery West, so familiarize yourself with that as well. We ask that you keep conifer trees limbed 5 feet from your home so that there's no branch touching a roof or touching the side of your house. We have spacing requirements for new and existing conifer trees in this zone. The trees must be 30 feet from trunk to trunk, and that's to prevent fire from spreading from the home and through the trees. We ask that dead vegetation be removed within that first 30 feet of the structure, because dead vegetation is fire fuel. We ask that all junipers, sage, bitterbrush, manzanite, and rabbit brush be removed because those are very flammable plants. And we ask that you keep your roofs and your gutters, patios, and your eaves clear of dead leaves, pine needles, and other flammable materials. That's all in zone 1. In zone 2, we've defined it actually as 30 feet to 100 feet. And it's basically very similar to what we've asked you to do in zone 1. No more than 2 conifers in a grouping, and the spacing between those tree trunks needs to be 40 feet. We ask that you clear your brush and you cut all grasses underneath the drip line of those conifer trees, again, because that's fire fuel. We ask that you mow or you prune any dense vegetation and break it up so that you've got space between the vegetation there and that it's not all clumped together, creating a really dense fire fuel situation. And we ask that you plant only fire-resistant plants and trees, again, going back to that list of approved plants that we've provided for you. Zone 3 in our definition is anything beyond 100 feet from your home. And you'll really only see that when you get out to those larger lots that are adjacent to the tree farm and in the last phases of Discovery West. Again, only approved fire-resistant plants and trees can be planted in that area. We do allow native vegetation to remain in that area. It's far enough away from the house that it's not an issue. It just needs to be maintained properly. Clear and cut your brush and any grasses underneath the drip line of the conifers, and mow and prune any of that dense vegetation. So that's getting into the specifics of Discovery West that really applies to the homes that you guys will be building for us in that neighborhood.
Okay.
Talked about all of those requirements. We talked about how that applies specifically into Discovery West. The greater side yard setbacks, you'll all see this in the exhibit that's attached to the design guidelines, but at Discovery West, we are going a little bit above and beyond what city requirements are. And on our smaller lots, the side setbacks are 7.5 feet. On the medium-sized lots, they are 10 feet. And when you get out to the larger lots, it's actually 20 feet. And that should give a really good, healthy separation between the homes.
Okay, so I think we're going to dive into a couple of resources that are available to you. And I would say I'm watching a recorded presentation is always a lot harder than getting to see you all kind of virtually in person, as it were. But a few of the resources that we wanted to touch on that are available to you, we have the websites kind of listed here. If y'all have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out kind of on resources and getting into a few of these. One of them, I think that it would be very, very helpful is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. So they're the institute that was doing these research projects. They also have guidance for everything you can possibly think of for building your structure. So everything from a guide on roofing to decking to venting. I mean, they have everything on there. So disastersafety.org, and it is a free resource. So if you are interested in getting into that, we're looking into more of the specifics to meet some of those guidelines in Discovery West. That is definitely a fantastic resource. Another one, as you guys probably will hear it quite a bit, is Firewise USA. Deschutes County has upwards of 35, I think closer to 40 now, Firewise sites. Those are communities that essentially taken on their own Firewise preparedness or their fire preparedness and taken steps to customize it and tailor it to their neighborhood. I would note that it's a national program that's put forth. It is not a regulatory program by its nature, but a lot of communities have taken it into their local governance. So whether that's, a resolution to their CC&Rs, or it is memorialized in their CC&Rs to then prepare themselves for fire. So Firewise is simply a national program that helps with education, but it puts forth a lot of these guidelines in both a grassroots effort and then helps educate folks on why these guidelines are important and why we push so hard on these, because at the end of the day, all of us want all of these homes to survive and for us to be safer at the end of the day.
Alison, on that note, just to let you guys know, I've touched on Firewise earlier, and Discovery West will be a Firewise community. It is in our governing documents that says we will do that. And so once we have homeowners living in Discovery West, and I believe we need at least 13 to 14 homes actively with residents in them, we'll form a Firewise committee, and that committee will work with the HOA board, and we'll have annual education as well as annual events that help just further that understanding of how owners and neighbors can come together to make their landscapes as resilient as possible.
Fabulous. That's always a good note to kind of keep in mind as we're building, essentially from the ground up, a lot of these communities that are, their expressed goal is to be Firewise at the end of the day. And so really understanding what Firewise is and what it isn't, I think is so critical to us as the professionals that are kind of on the ground all the way up to having these communities built and, folks living in them for years to come. The final piece, and it's such a fabulous resource, it's relatively new. It was put together and put out by the California State Fire Marshal's Office. But this, if you copy and paste that tiny URL, it will take you to a building materials list. So you can say, hey, I want vents that have these criteria, and it will list any fire resistant brand for you to order and get your hands on. So everything from, under home venting that has the correct covering, to there's this new vent that comes out that when it hits a certain temperature, it closes so embers can't impact the space. There's some really incredible things on there. So I would really encourage you to just kind of copy and paste that if you're having a hard time finding a material that meets some of these criteria. That is an excellent starting point for you to check out and find some of those building materials. For kind of resources, like I said, if there's anything that you can't find or you're having a hard time and you're wrestling with it, feel free to reach out. We can definitely do some searching to see what you need. If there's something that isn't clear, anything like that, we are definitely here as a resource.
Yeah, thank you. We have Craig Letts as a consultant on the Architectural Review Committee, helping us with fire mitigation from a landscaping and a construction material standpoint. So Craig's available for questions. Allison's a great resource. And I'll do my best to continue to funnel resources to the ARC so that they can keep those in front of you guys as we move forward in Discovery West. But I think we're off to a really good start. And I'm sorry this is a recording and we're not live with you for questions, but if you guys have any questions, please feel free to email those my way. And if I don't have the answer, I will get it for you. And I think you all have my email, but it's Romy, R-O-M-Y, @brooksresources.com. And I think that's it for today.
Fabulous. Well, thank you all for joining us again. I agree with Romy. I wish we could be with you all in virtual person at least, but feel free to reach out and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.